Welcome. Now, I want to say a few words about the Famous Artist School because this show and all other shows that I might do in this kind of format is about the great illustrators that were the guiding faculty members for the Famous Artist School. And if you look over to where my iPad is, you see a photograph there, and you see all of these great illustrators that were the guiding faculty members for the Famous Artist School, along with its founder, Albert Dorn, which you see way over on the left side there, those big bushy eyebrows that he had. And then next to Albert Dorn is Ben Saul. Then sitting down underneath Albert Dorn is Fred Ludekens. Then with his pipe in his mouth, Norman Rockwell. Then Stephen DeHanis, John Whitcomb, the painter of beautiful women. And next to John Whitcomb is the great Western artist Harold von Schmidt. And next to Harold von Schmidt is Al Parker. Then Peter Helk. Next is Austin Briggs. And then Robert Fawcett. And the last one way over on the right is George Juicy. So those were the guiding faculty members. And I also want to show you what the school looked like. It was located in Westport, Connecticut. So when you look over to the iPad, there's a photo of what the school looked like. And it was right next to the Saugatuck River in Westport, Connecticut. So I just wanted to tell you a few things about this school. And it's because of this school that I'm able to make this show, because this show is based on that school. Unfortunately, the doors to that school have been closed. You can no longer take their course and get the critique that art students used to be able to get. They would send in their art assignments. The art instructors there would critique the student's work and return the critique to the student along with a lengthy letter giving even more information about their art that was critiqued and how to improve their art. So this was a great method for study, and it's unfortunate that the school has closed its doors. I used to work for the Famous Artist School. I worked in their art department on the magazine that they would put out for their alumni and art students. And if you look over to where my iPad is, you can see a sample of what that magazine looked like. And that cover was done by the great illustrator and founder of the Famous Artist School, Albert Dorn. I also took their art course, so I'm very familiar with the way they taught and what they taught. And what they taught was what the great illustrators that were the guiding faculty members put into the textbooks that they put together for the Famous Artists course. So if you want to learn what these great illustrators knew, then you might want to check out my complete illustration art course, because that's what it teaches. And now it's time to begin with this show, which I think you're going to find rather unique. It's a different way of approaching teaching art, I think. And if you like this kind of format, if you like this style of teaching, let me know. And I might make more of these shows for you. This show is unlike any other that you've ever seen. And that's because I'm going to be bringing back some of the great illustrators from the past. And I'm going to try to give you the feeling that they are still with us, even though they have passed on long ago. Yes, it can be done. And how it is done? Well, it's done with a time machine, of course. And I happen to have one that you see right in back of me here. With this time machine, I can bring back these great illustrators and sit them down right next to me here so that you get the feeling that they're still alive, still here, still with us, teaching us. That's the whole idea of this talk show-like setting that I've created, to give you the illusion or feeling that these great illustrators are still with us and teaching us. And the first great illustrator I'm going to be bringing back from the past, using my time machine that you see in back of me here, is the great Norman Rockwell. Now, the guiding faculty members for the Famous Artist School, they all put together a textbook. And what I'm going to be showing you are pages from the textbook that Norman Rockwell put together for the Famous Artist School. So I'm going to be reading from his pages so that you're going to be hearing exactly what Norman Rockwell wrote, exactly what he thought about picture making. So you'll be learning from him. And then when you see him sitting here on the couch, you'll get the feeling like he is teaching you directly. Now, I'm going to be cranking up the old time machine any moment to bring in Norman Rockwell and sit him down right next to me here. But before I do that, I just want to show you a painting of his. And if you look over to your left, you can see that easel. And on that easel now sits one of Norman Rockwell's paintings. Before this time machine brings in Mr. Rockwell, I just want to introduce you to the inventor of this magnificent time machine, without which this show would not be possible, because I wouldn't be able to bring back these great illustrators from the past without a time machine like this. So let me bring in this brilliant inventor right now. And there he is. And let me just say that this is also the long-lost son of the great Albert Einstein. That's why he was able to invent this time machine. He inherited the brilliance of Einstein. Actually, he's even more intelligent than Einstein. Einstein was not able to build a time machine, but the old fella here, whose real name is actually Giuseppe Einstein, was able to build a time machine. And now, it's almost time to crank up the old time machine, get it going, and locate Mr. Rockwell wherever he may be, and bring him into my studio, and sit him down on this comfortable couch right here. And let me check with Giuseppe now. Hello, Giuseppe, can you hear me? He says he can hear me. Are you ready to crank up the time machine, get it going, and search for Mr. Rockwell wherever he may be? Now, Giuseppe is telling me he has fine-tuned the time machine, and it is ready to go. He has located Mr. Rockwell, and the time machine is jettisoning him through the time warp right now, and Mr. Rockwell is going to appear on my couch at any moment. However, you have to understand that there are going to be some side effects, and they occur when you travel through the time warp. Unfortunately, Mr. Rockwell will not be able to move or speak because of those side effects that occur. But of course, you'll be able to see him sitting here on my couch and watching everything that is occurring. Wait a minute. There he is. Welcome to Art Masters from the Past show, Mr. Rockwell. I hope you had a good trip here. Now, I understand you can't move and you can't speak because of those side effects. You're frozen, so to speak, until the show is over. And now, let's start with the show by bringing in some pages from Mr. Rockwell's great textbook and placing them on my iPad you see over here. I should also mention that I'm going to be replaced here with the actual textbook of Norman Rockwell. So you won't be seeing a video of me, you'll be seeing the textbook displayed here within this window. So here is a page from the famous artist's school textbook that Norman Rockwell puts together. And everything in this textbook is exactly what Norman Rockwell thought about picture making. These are his own words. And I'm going to enlarge this page so that you can see what he wrote, and I'll read it. So he said, the importance of figure and posture. We have considered the importance of heads and of facial expression in telling a story. And I have cited some examples which I hope have demonstrated that hands are almost as important as heads in storytelling pictures. And that feet, arms, legs, the entire body, in fact, can be made to aid in conveying a message. And this brings up the importance of figure and of posture in pictures. Spare the model and spoil the picture. Someone has observed. Along with the head and the hands, the figure and posture must help to convey what you wish to say. I consider posture so important that in planning a pose, I usually make a matchstick sketch like that shown with the early baseball player picture in order to figure out in advance how best to express the action. Never spare the model or yourself in getting the best pose to tell your story. Perhaps you will find, as I have that taking many photographs makes the task of finding the right pose much easier for you and your model. So, try many sketches and many poses until you get what you need. Some great thinker has said, genius is the ability to take infinite pains. Perhaps right here is the place to offer you an apology. As you continue these lessons and find me referring continually to my own pictures and pointing out what I think are their good qualities, you will probably begin to wonder at my conceit. The only reason I am doing this is that I can more easily explain by citing my own examples. I know why I made a picture a certain way, but I may not understand why some other artist made his a certain way. Believe me, I know better than anyone else that none of my pictures are even near masterpieces, and I know that some of them distinctly smell. So now I'm going to move up the page where you can see this stick figure or stick figures that he mentions, and here you can see his Saturday Evening Post cover painting that he did. And like he said, he worked out the poses in little rough stick figure sketches like you see here. Just very simple. Here, Rockwell shows you exactly how he designs the pose of his figures. And you can see that using the matchstick or stick figure idea gives you a clear idea of what the lines are and whether they're rhythmic or angular, horizontal or vertical. You can see a line running through the figure like that, which is the action line, as it's called. And then you see another line for the leg, and then for the umpire's legs back here, it makes that curve. And then there's a curve here where his arm is coming down and continuing into the side of the leg over here. You see, there's a framework structure, and you can work out the design very successfully when you reduce everything down to just simple lines like this. There's a beauty here in the construction of this design. You see these curves being repeated, forming a rhythmic underlying framework structure upon which the more realistic depiction of the figures sits or rests. Now, it's not quite as simple as you may think, because you have to know how to put together these lines to form a really good underlying structure. So here you see the entire page again, but the painting is too small, so I'm going to enlarge it so you can get a much better look at it. And I'm just going to quickly point out the underlying framework structure that I showed you earlier, but now I'm going to apply it to the actual painting here. Running through the entire pose is this rhythmic action line like that, and then at the contour there's a rhythmic line starting at his hat, coming down to his back and around to his leg. And then also that figure in the back has that curve running through the legs that you saw earlier in his little sketch. And there's a curve right here where his arm is and coming down into the leg. So there's a curve on his back and a curve here. So those curves are in harmony. And I could continue that shoulder edge like that with what's called an invisible line. So there's a curve coming all the way around like that. And then, of course, his leg coming up like this and down. Now, what else I want to point out to you that that wasn't talked about earlier is the fact that within this pose here, there's a repetition of direction which helps to strengthen the pose. You see the leg has that direction, but then when you come down to the lower leg here, that also has a similar direction. Then this leg has that direction, but that leg has a similar direction. So there's this repetition of direction helping to strengthen the pose. So what I also want to point out to you is that there are a lot of angles a lot of straight lines opposed to curves. Right here, there's a curve. The back, of course, is a curve. The hat, the top of the hat, the top of this guy's hat. Here there are curves on his socks. Straight line. That's a curve, as I pointed out to you. A curve here. Then there's a straight line, but they're at an angle. The leg is at an angle. The top of the leg, angle. Bottom, angle. This leg at an angle. The foot also at an angle. The lower leg at an angle. That leg at an angle. Even the fellow in the back there, that leg is at an angle. Those angles help to create a greater feeling of movement, action. It enlivens the whole painting. And it gives the feeling of animation, like these figures are animated, like they're moving. So that's another layer to this great painting. There are a number of layers or levels to the painting that makes this such a great painting. I can't go into all of the various levels that can be found in this painting. There's just no time. But I pointed out some of them to you. So I hope you keep some of these things in mind that I pointed out to you about Rockwell's great painting and try to apply what he said to your own artwork when posing figures. So here's another page, and this page continues what I read about on the previous page, and you can see his great covers here. I'm going to enlarge this so that you can see what he wrote. These are his actual words, and it may not be 100% clear, but I think it's clear enough that you can make out what the words are. But I'm going to read them to you like I did on the previous page. Now, he says, compare the postures of the figures in the above pictures, which I'm going to show you. So you see that cover, and you see the little stick figures that he drew. And then here's another cover, and just a little doodle-like sketch of the figures. And then he breaks down the poses into very simple lines, like you see here, for example, right there. You see just an angled line like that, and then an angled line like that, which is actually the structure of these poses here. You see that angle there, and then the angle here of the other figure. So that is the essence of the pose. You can see the same thing over here. See how simply the postures or poses can be broken down into just very simple lines. Now, let me get back to what I started reading here. So let me start again. Compare the postures of the figures in the above pictures with those of the figures on the opposite page. There is no peace and quiet here, but exactly the opposite idea, conflict and action. In the football picture, we gain the impression of an irresistible force meeting an immovable object. Wham! Here, I was not trying for graceful lines, but for straight ones and for opposing angles, as indicated in the matchstick sketch. In the war picture, I used the old stunt of a rigid, straight figure set against moving and active figures. So let me bring that back. You see, here's that straight line that he's talking about, and then these angles against the straight, rigid line. The straight, motionless figure makes the moving figures all the more active and vice versa. This is an old, tired, and true trick, but still a good one. The Yankee Doodle picture reproduced here, which is this one below right there, is a case in point. It shows a lot of storytelling poses, but it is a far cry from a masterpiece, and I know it. In it, I tried for an endless variety of poses. There are figures standing, sitting, leaning, riding, running, pulling, pointing. I made this sketch before getting in any models. I tried to carry it as far as I could so I could make my models fit my conception of the picture, instead of making my picture fit the poses struck by the models. I made some changes, but for the most part, the figures in the final painting were quite similar in their poses to those in this sketch. If you find a pose you like, admire it, but do not try to repeat it. Try for endless variety in poses. It is very bad if you allow yourself to follow a formula in poses. Howard Pyle, the great American illustrator, once advised his students to climb through the frame and into the picture. In other words, become a part of your picture. Try to get inside your characters and feel how they would sit or walk or stand or run under the circumstances of the story. If you do this with every picture you ever make, your pictures will carry conviction and realism, and you will not find yourself repeating or getting into a rut. So now I'm going to reduce the size of this page so you can see the entire page and his beautiful artwork here. So here's yet another page from his great textbook. And you can see this great painting that he did here. And he talks about that. Here again, you can see these quick, rough, stick figure-like, thumbnail-like, or doodle-like sketches that he does to work out the pose. So here he says, "Here is a quiet, peaceful scene. And I tried, with the aid of graceful lines, unlike the more angular lines that you saw earlier in his paintings, more graceful lines can be seen in these figures, to give it the charm of past times. I did not want sharp, opposing lines and masses to give a feeling of conflict or action. This is important. Decide on the mood of the picture, then make every pose convey that mood and express that idea. The attention of all the figures is focused on the painting, but the pose of each is different, so that and I'll continue here, so that the same emotion is expressed in 4 different ways. The squire has an air of relaxed dignity. The tavern keeper expresses admiring astonishment. The girl leans forward, fascinated, and the painter himself is entirely oblivious of his audience. Each member of the group is moved by the same impulse, concentration, but each expresses it in a different way." So I'm going to return the page to actual size here. And here again, you see, in the pose of the figures, he is concerned with working out the essence of the pose. That is, those kind of simple lines that I pointed out to you earlier. And here he talks about graceful lines, and you can see that here and over here in the painting. You see, and on the figure here, there's a curve here, and then a curve here. And you see that even in this little rough sketch that he does with just a few simple lines, you see those curves, and those curves are carried over into the finished painting that you see here. He's looking for a simple underlying structure, and you see a simple curve here in the leg and over here as well. These are graceful lines like you see over here. You see the graceful curving lines like this. And then in the painter here sitting on the bench, you see this kind of curving line. You see, like that. These are more graceful lines like he talks about, and not sharp, opposing lines, more angular lines, which would be more appropriate for a mood of action, of violence, or conflict. So the kind of lines that you use to establish the pose will help to determine what the mood of the painting will be, the mood of the figures themselves. Now, students, when they work out a pose, they'll just start sketching something like that. Somebody sitting in a chair, maybe, something like that. Or maybe just standing there like that. The student is totally unaware of the fact that the pose has to be designed so that it is based on a rhythmic underlying structure, like Rockwell showed in his paintings that I showed you, like, for example, the baseball player with the umpire, that Saturday Evening Post cover. Those poses were designed to have a certain linear structure to them. And Rockwell, as you saw, begins with a simple sketch. He's working out a pose, and he's thinking of what the story is. What story does this pose tell? What mood does it establish? So he wants a certain mood, And if he wants a more violent mood, then he has to think in terms of angles like that, a more angular looking pose, which can establish a more violent mood. But if he's interested in establishing a more relaxed feeling or more relaxed mood in the figure, then he's thinking more in terms of rhythmic curving lines, maybe like that. Just like he mentions in his textbook. So here you see more angular lines. Here you see more curving, rhythmic, flowing, more graceful lines, which helps to express a more relaxed feeling. So he's designing the pose, establishing this kind of simple linear framework structure. He's not concerned with details in the beginning. He's only concerned with telling a certain story and getting a certain mood within the pose of the figure. Before I show you another page from Norman Rockwell's textbook, I just want to mention that one of the common errors that art students make is that they clutter up their drawings and paintings with a lot of irrelevant objects, and what then happens is that the main point of focus, the center of interest as it's called, gets lost because of all these other objects that are in the drawing or painting. And therefore, the eye of the viewer doesn't really know where to look because there's just too much going on. And what I'm going to show you now is one of Norman Rockwell's color sketches, although the entire textbook is in black and white. But the color sketch that he did is this one here, in black and white, of course, because they didn't print the textbooks for the famous artist school of the guiding faculty members way back when the school first started in color. Those textbooks, those original textbooks that were made by the guiding faculty members were all in black and white, except for some pages that were in color, but very few. He wasn't satisfied with this composition here. And can you see why? It's because of what I just mentioned, what art students do and what they shouldn't be doing. And I'm going to read the text here. This is what he wrote. Now, the two men dominate the situation because of a better tonal relationship, but there still seemed to be too much competition from the people and objects in the background because of a similarity in size. Also, this might be a night scene, whereas I was trying to depict an early morning departure. And you can see this, I think, very clearly, that all these other shapes surrounding the center of interest, which of course are these two men here, are detracting from these two figures, the center of interest. Specifically, it's this figure here that is the main focus of the entire painting. You notice that this man blends in a bit more with the background. The background is dark, the man has a dark value. But this man here has a light value placed against the man with the darker value, and therefore he stands out. But nevertheless, even though he dominates through value contrast, he doesn't stand out enough because of these objects surrounding him that are of similar size, as he mentions in his caption, and also because of too much value contrast going on in other parts of the painting that distract from him. So what does he do? Well, I'm going to show you another color sketch that he did, but again in black and white, in which he worked out this problem. And here he shows you his solution. And immediately, of course, you can see that there is a dominance of size for these figures. They are the largest shapes and forms within this color sketch. And the buildings have been placed way back in the distance along with those figures that you saw in this version here. You see how big the figures are here and how big these buildings are compared to what he does here. So this composition is one that he was satisfied with, and he carried this to a finished painting. Now I'm going to read what he wrote down here. So he writes, "It was a tough fight, but I won. Now, there is no unnecessary competition from the background. This camp could be located anywhere, and any tourist can enjoy this picture and project himself into it, whether he has traveled in the mountains or not. The key of the picture and the color scheme better indicates early morning and people getting off to an early start. In the early versions, it seemed to be a night scene I was depicting rather than a morning one. This picture has a further advantage. The figure in the foreground has more meaning because of the gesture of the extended right arm. Here, Rockwell applies one of the supreme design principles that you'll be learning about through my complete illustration art course. And that is the principle of dominance. And there are different kinds of dominances. Here, the dominance, as I mentioned, is a dominance of size. But there can also be a dominance of value contrast. When the eye goes to a strong contrast of values, that becomes dominant within the painting when other value contrasts are much less. Now, the fact that he made these shapes back here much smaller makes those shapes much less important than the ones in the foreground. So, depending on what size you make your shapes will determine how important they are. And of course, in this version, these background shapes are too important because they're too large in size. And all of this, as I mentioned, and as he mentions, is competing with the figures in the foreground. So by simplifying the composition, like this, and creating this negative space or negative shape here, not putting anything in here, and then contrasting it with the more active area where you find a lot of different shapes, that also helps to focus attention on the figures here because there isn't anything back here. By keeping that background really simple like that, that further helps to focus attention here and not distract the eye of the viewer to other parts of the painting. So he places an active area against a quiet area. This is also a very important principle of design. Now in Mr. Rockwell's textbook, he shows you the step-by-step procedure that he followed in making his great paintings. And I'm going to bring in the pages that show you what those steps are. So here's the first page, and I'm going to enlarge this so that you can see what he wrote. And I'm going to read this. It says, "How I make a picture. This spread and the next show, in a very general way, how I make a picture. In later lessons, I will go into detail about each of these steps. But I want you to know my general procedure now so you'll understand what I mean when I mention one of these specific steps. My method is not necessarily the best way to proceed, but it is my way. I suggest that you follow my way during this course. Then, having learned one way, you can use this knowledge and experience to develop a method which best fits your own abilities and temperament. This may seem like a long and laborious system, but over the years I have found that for me at least, it is the best in the end because it saves me many false starts and much wasted time." So I'm going to scroll up here so that you can see his sketches. These are the initial sketches for this particular painting that he made, and you can see that they're rough sketches. This is how he started, and this is how you should start. You start with rough sketches, and I'm going to go down here to where it says step 1, getting the idea. It is extremely important to develop a cover idea which is good. No matter how well you paint a storytelling picture, if the idea is not good, it will be a failure, and people will ignore it. When I have an idea developed to this stage, I try it out on everyone I can induce to look at my sketch. I tell them what I'm trying to do. I show them my sketch and I watch their reactions. If people seem uninterested or only mildly interested, I abandon the idea and search for another one. Only when people become enthusiastic do I become enthusiastic too, and then I'm anxious to get to painting. Never be afraid to discard an idea if it does not seem to ring the bell. Later, I will describe in detail how I start from scratch to develop an idea. So let me bring this back down so you can take a careful look at these sketches. You can already see in these first initial sketches the beginning of a value pattern. In this sketch here, for example, the value pattern is a very simple one, and all of this is a light pattern, light values placed against a simple dark pattern. So this is basically right now, as it is, light against dark. And of course there are some darker values within this light pattern which have to be applied, otherwise he wouldn't be able to give any definition as to what this pattern is supposed to be. But the values are kept light. They're all kept light so that they form an overall light value pattern. Now he might change this pattern, but right now, the way it is, this is the pattern that he is deciding on at this stage in the development of the painting. And I can see that Mr. Rockwell is still sitting on the couch there, still with us and enjoying this show, I hope. And as you can see, he's watching the iPad, probably trying to figure out what the heck is that thing. Now, as I've shown you, this step here is step number 1. I'm going to now move on to step 2. And here is the page for both step 2 and step 3. I'm going to enlarge this page. And here you can see the model that he used for this painting. And over here on the right side, you can see some of the props that he used, like the frame, the elaborate looking frame. Now scrolling up to where step 2 says getting the models. So I'm going to read this. After getting the right idea, getting the right models to put over the idea is important. This model is president of one of America's largest book publishing companies. I tried 3 men before I found him, and he was just what I wanted. He had the characteristics called for in my picture, and he certainly could and did act. Most of the models which I use are my friends and neighbors. Almost anyone will pose for you, especially if you make photographs and work from them, because it requires little time to pose for photographs. New models add new interest to your work. So, do not use the same ones repeatedly. And if the people in your pictures are to look real, your models must be real people, not imaginative ones. Now, moving over to step 3 here, it says getting the props. That's step 3, getting the props. So I'm going to read this. The problem of props is similar to the model problem. I go to almost any lengths to get exactly the right objects to go into my picture, which I make. Just as it is important to have the right types of people in a picture to express an idea, it is also important to have exactly the right objects. Research often is necessary to determine what props are correct for the idea and the subject. Having searched for and found desirable props, you must be sure that they are authentic. In this case, my entire picture was inspired by the amazing frame which I found in an old junk shop in Troy, New York. I rented the helmet, shirt, and horn in New York. I love to get the genuine articles, and the public loves it too. So I'm going to scroll down so that you can see the model again and the props over here. Now, as he writes, it's important to have just the right props. And if you're an art student, you might not think a lot about props. You have to consider many things before you find just the right props. Props can determine what your composition is going to be like. You have to consider what the shape of the props should be. You just can't put in any kind of props with any kind of shapes. Those shapes have to harmonize with all the other shapes or contrast with them, be in opposition to them. You have to consider what the proportions of the props are. and what the texture is, the shape of the props, what lines do the props have? Is there some kind of symbolical significance that you can attribute to the props that help to tell your story, that help to get your message across? And that's what props do. They help to tell the story. So you have to get the right props that will tell the story that you want to tell. Just like in this painting by Norman Rockwell. These props help to tell his story. So there are many things to consider when selecting props. You don't just select props haphazardly and without giving them some thought. They have to fit into the composition. They have to make a good composition. And now, as Mr. Rockwell continues to watch what is going on here and probably still trying to figure out what an iPad is, I'm going to now move on to the next page. And here it is. So I'm going to enlarge this page. And right here, you can see Mr. Rockwell, he's taking the pose that he thinks his model should take. And I'm going to read what he writes here. So step 4, getting the pose. Stare the model and you spoil the picture. So here I am striking the pose and acting it out to show the model just what I want. Once you have found the right model, you must induce him to strike the right pose for your picture. You must be a sort of movie director to get the most out of your models. Almost anyone can act if given enough encouragement. So toss away your pride and dignity and do the posing yourself to help your model lose his self-consciousness and get the feel of the idea. Facial expression is of the utmost importance in expressing an idea. So after you have found the right type of person for your picture, coax him to act like the character he is to portray. And he will. So again, that's what the pose looks like that he would like the model to take. He's acting out the pose as he writes. And moving on to step number 5 here, and this is the preliminary sketch. So I'm going to read what he writes in step 5. So step 5, making the preliminary sketch. This is the charcoal sketch which I made after I had selected my model, taken my photographs, and assembled my props. This preliminary sketch is usually smaller in size than the finished painting will be. This one was about 20 by 22 inches. In this sketch, I tried to anticipate and solve each problem of each detail of my picture so I will encounter no unpleasant surprises, which might involve making changes after I start to paint. This is a complete expression of my idea in line, composition, and tone. In fact, in everything but color. Sometimes I feel that making this preliminary sketch is the most creative part of the whole process of making a picture. Later, we will consider all the details of this important step. So let me bring that sketch down so you can see it. Preliminary sketch. And this painting was done for the Saturday Evening Post cover. Now you might notice that in this preliminary sketch, he still has that same value pattern that I pointed out to you in his first initial sketches that he did. In those rough sketches where I said that this was a light pattern, which it still is, placed against a dark pattern. So again, it's a simple pattern, a value pattern of light against dark. But within this light pattern here, you can see darker values have been placed. So I'm going to enlarge his sketch even more, something like that. And here you see a dark value, and then there's another dark value here, which is a bow tie that this character is wearing. And then there are some darks up here, and here, and here, and of course his eyebrows. And those dark accents, they form a vertical direction, like that. So the eye travels along those accents vertically, like this. It's just a really simple and beautiful value pattern. Now I should mention that this pattern might change because this is step 5 and there's still some more work that he's going to be doing on this composition. You have to think of it in terms of composition. So I'm going to reduce the size now and move on to the next page. So here is step 6 and the final step, number 7. So again, I'm going to enlarge the page so that you can get a good look at his pictures here. So this one on the left, as you can read down here, it's a color sketch, but then the one on the right, that's actually the finished painting. Even though it says the finished drawing, this is actually the finished painting. So I'm going to read what he wrote here. So step 6, making the color sketch. After doing the preliminary sketch, in which I attempted to solve most of my problems except color, I tackled the color problem by making this color sketch. I made it the exact size of the magazine cover. By doing this, I was able to judge better how it would show up on the newsstands. The color, of course, must be strong and pleasing, but it also should help to tell the story which you are trying to tell. Color can aid greatly in expressing an idea and very often can set the mood of your picture. If your picture is an amusing one, the color should express gaiety. Those colors would not be suitable for a sad story. In the latter case, such colors as blues, grays, and black might be used to establish the mood of your picture. And then reading on to where it says step 7, the finished drawing, he says, "This is the final picture which appeared on the cover of the Post. You will find that your pictures rarely turn out to be the masterpieces of which you dream and for which you hope when you start them. But if you have done your best, that is all which anyone can be asked to do. There is always the next job, and you promise yourself that the next one really will be the masterpiece, the perfect picture. That is what keeps you going. And if you ever lose this reviving hope, you have finished as a creative artist. Do not congratulate yourself too heartedly on what you have just done. Start your next picture with new knowledge and enthusiasm and a determination to make it the very best painting you have ever made." So let me scroll down so that you can see these pictures again. Now when you compare the two pictures here, you can see the color sketch that he did retain this light pattern against a dark one. But when you look at his finished painting, he darkened that pattern somewhat. He actually darkened the whole pattern. It's no longer as light as it was in the earlier stages of working out this composition and this value pattern. Value pattern is part of composition. So he decided that it would be better if the pattern was darker. Now let me just mention something about the props that he's using. And as he mentioned earlier, the props he's using, of course, are this beautiful picture frame and the helmet, as well as the horn that he's holding, and the cigar. So you see 4 props. He uses an economy of props, which means that he uses fewer props rather than too many props to tell his story. And this is not that easy to do. An art student may put a lot of props into his or her drawing or painting, thinking that the more props there are, the more clear the story is going to be. Well, it doesn't work that way. Using fewer props and the right kind of props, like I mentioned earlier, you have to consider various things before you add props to your picture. And when you use fewer props, you can tell your story more clearly, and things won't look confusing to the viewer. So therefore, in this case, Mr. Rockwell decided that fewer props are needed to tell his story. He doesn't need to add any more props than these 4. And now I'm going to bring the whole page back down. So here is yet another page from Mr. Rockwell's great textbook that I'm going to read from. I see that Giuseppe just popped up in back of Mr. Rockwell. Giuseppe, what are you doing back there? I'm getting a message from him. He's saying that his eyeball just dropped out again, and it rolled in back of the couch, and he needs to find that eyeball, and he was wondering if he could ask Mr. Rockwell if Mr. Rockwell had seen his eyeball. Giuseppe, remember, Mr. Rockwell cannot speak because of that side effect. And Giuseppe is telling me he needs to find that eyeball, otherwise he cannot fire up the time machine and send Mr. Rockwell back wherever he came from, because he needs to be able to see the flux capacitor, and he can't see the flux capacitor without that eyeball. Well, get out of there, will you? If Mr. Rockwell sees you, you might scare him to death. Now, I'm going to enlarge this so that you can see his great painting close up. That's what it looks like. Make this even bigger. And then I'm going to show you this here, which is a color sketch, but of course it's in black and white because his textbook is almost entirely in black and white. So he works out his color in a rough sketch like this. And then here he shows some of the shapes and where he placed them. And some of these white shapes are actually in his color sketch or in his painting red, color red, that he adds throughout the painting. And it's done because that creates what's called, or some artists call it, color circulation. That helps to move the eye of the viewer throughout the painting, leading him from one part to another and helping to unify the painting as well. So now I'm going to read what he wrote here, starting at the top. It says, "Think things through in advance." A warm red was the dominant color in this post cover. It appears in everything except the bed linen, the towels on the door, the white chair, the tablecloth, and the sign outside the window. In the color sketch, I was concerned only with establishing the correct color and value relationships. All other details had been worked out carefully in a charcoal drawing. The photograph of the underpainting shows the imprimatura on the canvas. This was done with transparent glazes of red, which permitted the charcoal drawing to show through. Some of the light areas were accentuated by covering them with opaque white. I find it very important to establish the projected tone and color relationships on the finished canvas as soon as possible. This enables me to keep all the details properly subordinated to the picture as a whole. Underpainting of this kind ensures a more harmonious relationship of colors. This is just another demonstration that you must think things through at all times. Imagination and inspiration are essential for successful pictures, but they are not all that is necessary. Organization of your work is important if your imagination and inspiration are to be expressed fully. It is for this reason that I stress the importance of having your picture completely under control at all stages. Just as a reminder, here are some of those important stages. And never proceed from one stage to the next until you are sure that you have solved all of the problems that must be solved in the stage you are finishing. And here is the list of the stages he goes through. Stage number 1, the doodle or idea sketch. Number 2, selection of the model and props. The third thing he does, photographing the models. Then, number 4, the charcoal drawing. Number 5, the color sketch. Number 6, the imprimatura that he refers to. And then number 7, the final painting. So let's take a look at that painting once again. I wish this painting was in color so that I could see what it looks like in color. But even in black and white like this, it's beautifully organized, great value pattern. It's just a terrific painting. I want to show you this from his textbook. And here you see Mr. Rockwell doing a charcoal sketch. That's what he would do. And he would do a very detailed charcoal sketch. And you can see he has a photograph right there that he's working from. And if you know anything about how Rockwell worked, you know that he used photos. And on the right side here, you see the finished charcoal sketch that
he's working on over here. Now you might be thinking, well, how did Rockwell proceed from the charcoal sketch? How did he paint his picture? Well, the first step, of course, was to do a charcoal sketch on canvas. That's what he did. Once he finished the charcoal sketch, he would then add fixative to it. He would spray the entire charcoal sketch with fixative so that the charcoal sketch wouldn't smear. Once that was done, he would then tone the entire canvas. And he would use a raw umber, something like this color here. And he would just put that raw umber over the entire surface. He didn't want to work on a white canvas. A white canvas isn't very inviting looking. And also, when the surface is toned, something like this, you can then better judge value contrast when you start putting down the different values than if you had a white surface on which to work. Toning the surface like this, it helps to reduce the strong, more stark-looking value contrasts. And it can also help to set the mood and help in achieving more harmonious color relationships. But I don't want to go into that here. So what's the next step after this? Well, the next step would be to do the underpainting. So Mr. Rockwell would select one color. The underpainting would be a monochromatic painting. Therefore, he would select one color that he would then use to do the entire underpainting with. So let's say in this case, maybe he selected a blue. And then he would follow what the values are in his charcoal sketch. So if there was a dark value, like on the sleeves of this ball player here, he would add a dark blue, like that. Where there's a light value, he would then change the blue to a lighter blue, like this, and add that. Now what he would do is he would use dry brush. He would use the dry brush technique to do the underpainting with. So something like this. Lighter blue here, darker blue over here on his sleeves. And then let's say the dugout right over here. That is green in his finished painting. So he wouldn't paint it green, not at this stage, not for the underpainting. He would still be using blue, if that's the color that he used. Not sure which color he used for this particular underpainting. The value is more of a middle value, so he would apply a middle value blue, like that. After the underpainting was finished, then Mr. Rockwell would apply a thin coat of shellac over the underpainting to seal it off, so that when he painted over the underpainting and he wanted to make changes, he could wipe out what he did without affecting the underpainting. The shellac kept the underpainting intact. So therefore, when he applied color over the underpainting, when he went to the next stage or step in his process, that underpainting wouldn't interfere with the paint that he applied over the underpainting, because that underpainting was sealed off. So now, what would the next step be in his process? Painting in the local colors. That was the next step in his process. So what are the local colors in this painting? Well, the dugout back here is green. So he would mix a green for the dugout, something like that, letting some of the blue of the underpainting mix in with the green. Colors mingle somewhat. That helps to create a bit of color variety. Then he'd add a darker green where the shadows are. I'm doing this really quick and rough, of course. I'm just pointing out the various steps that he followed in doing a painting, which he shows in his textbook. So the uniform, the baseball uniform, is a gray, and I'll add a gray to the underpainting like this. And I'm going to show you the finished painting later on. So something like this, you see, and some of that underpainting shows through and mixes with the gray. So he would just continue building up the color and changing the values and color. I'm going to gray it a little bit more. I'm just, of course, roughing this in. So after the local color was put in, the next step would then be adding light and shadow. Something like this. And of course, I'm doing this really rough and quick. Some light falling on his sleeve over here like this. So that would be the next step. So all of this is the shadow, of course. And then he would add darker darks within the shadow. That light is a bit more intense that's falling on him, as you'll see in the finished painting that I'm going to show you. Then he would make changes where changes are needed, like for example the green on the dugout is a little too saturated, a little too light, so he would just paint over it, applying the correct value and color. So here I just wanted to show you his process, the steps he would follow to arrive at a finished painting. Now I'm going to show you his finished painting, and what a beauty it is. And I think that's about all I'm going to say about this.
And moving on to yet another page from Mr. Rockwell's textbook. And here at the top of the page, you can see Mr. Rockwell sitting in front of his drawing that he is doing with the aid of what is called a Balopticon. And I'm going to enlarge this photograph of him and the Balopticon. You can see the Balopticon right over here on the right side. And that Balopticon projects a photograph onto a surface on which Mr. Rockwell is doing a drawing, and he is tracing the photograph. He often worked this way, and he mentions that here in his textbook, and I'll read that to you later. But that's not the only way he worked. He also did drawings, of course, without the help of the Balopticon. Before you can successfully do a drawing like this of people or characters, you first need to know a lot about figure drawing. You need to know anatomy and many other things. Otherwise, that drawing is not going to be successful. It's going to look terrible. So you art students out there who think all you need to do is use a machine like this, just trace the photograph, and voila, I have a beautiful drawing. No, unfortunately, it's not that simple to be able to do a really good drawing. Mr. Rockwell, of course, knew exactly what to do, what changes needed to be made in order to make that drawing look really great. So I'm going to enlarge this caption and read what it says here. Here I am, working with the aid of the Balopticon, which operates like the old magic lantern, projecting a sketch or photograph, not larger than 5 1/2 inches, to almost any size you desire. The farther away from the Balopticon the reflected image is, the greater the enlargement. So I'm going to scroll up to what he writes here. How and why I use the Balopticon. The Balopticon is an evil, inartistic, habit-forming, lazy, and vicious machine. It also is a useful, time-saving, practical, and helpful one. I use one often, and am thoroughly ashamed of it. I hide it whenever I hear people coming. My 2 lame excuses for using it are, most of the other fellows use it. Yes, you might be surprised. Many of those great illustrators did use a machine like this. But not always, of course. Just as Mr. Rockwell didn't always use a Balopticon. And let me read on here. And nowadays, you don't drive a horse and buggy when you can use a car. But still, I am ashamed of using a Balopticon, and later I will tell you how I am able to use it less and less. Nevertheless, I always will have one on hand because it is a great help in many wholly good and legitimate ways. Anyway, you should have one, and the best one I know of is made by Bausch and Lomb of Rochester, New York. Such a machine costs about $175. Way back in Rockwell's time, that was the cost. Here is the way I use mine. I place my original rough sketch, which I made before I used any models in the Balopticon. Then I place my drawing board with the erased detail paper on it, on the vertical easel. I then tried different sizes of enlargement by moving the easel either nearer to or farther away from the machine until I decide what size I want to paint the particular subject under consideration. This is one operation in which the Balopticon is a great help, because you can see the perfect and complete enlargement of the sketch on your paper, and it gives you a fine idea of just what size you will want to make your finished drawing. Personally, I like to paint the human head about 5 inches in height. When I have decided what size I want to make the drawing, I draw the reflected sketch on the detail paper with charcoal, lightly and in outline. Then I take the photograph of the most important figure and place that in the Balopticon and enlarge it to the size of the same figure on the enlarged drawing of the sketch. I then erase the figure in the enlargement of the sketch and draw in lightly in charcoal the outline from the figure in the photograph. And here is another page in which he explains what he does when he uses the Balopticon. So he writes right over here, this part. He says, when using the Balopticon in this way, I do not simply copy everything which is projected from the photograph. Instead, I make many, many changes, large and small, in order to make the drawing like the image in my mind of what I want to portray. I cannot emphasize this point too much. The real danger in using the Balopticon is that you will develop a lazy tendency to follow the image exactly instead of following the creative idea or image within yourself. For example, I may make a head smaller in proportion to the body than it appears in the photograph, or lengthen the neck, or enlarge an ear. There are many, much smaller changes which I make instinctively if I am following the creative idea or image in my own mind. Never just thoughtlessly copy the projection of the photograph. So here is the page in which he shows you the drawing that he made from the tracing of the photo of this character here. And I'm going to enlarge this page so that you can see the character close up. Right here, you can see what the tracing looks like, the tracing of the photograph. And you can see that it doesn't look very good. But certain things are captured, like the position of the features, the proportions of the features in the head. And what needs to be done is quite a bit of work to make this a really good drawing, which Mr. Rockwell shows you on this page. So I'm going to come over here and read what he wrote here. So this is step by step. Now he says, this is a photograph and my drawing of it made with the help of the Balopticon. I have made some seemingly slight changes in doing the drawing, but these changes will mean a lot when I do the finished drawing with the help of this outline. The skill and taste which you use in making such changes represents your own personal feeling and helps to make your work distinctive and your own. Never try to be different just to be different or just for effect, and never try to create a superficial style. Feel intensely what you draw or paint. Then your work will automatically take on your distinctive personality and will be recognized as yours and only yours. I used an HB Wolf pencil on this. Now I'm going to come down on the magnification a bit and show you the other drawings he made. So here in step 3, you can already see him making changes to that outline drawing, and that's what he does. He just makes an outline drawing of the projected image that the Balopticon gave him. And let me enlarge this again so that you can see that it's just an outline. There's no shading or anything. And let's go down to step 3. So here's a close-up of what it looks like right now. Again, he hasn't really applied any shading yet. He's just making changes to the features and various parts of the head. So let me read what he writes here. In making a charcoal drawing, after blowing it up with the aid of a Balopticon, I start by outlining the drawing, using a very sharp charcoal stick. I do not rough it in with large, bold strokes, but do the work carefully and as thoughtfully as I can. So now moving on to 4, you can see that he is starting to add shading, the dark tone of the hair and the dark tone of the shadow that he's starting to add to the side of the face here. So let's see what he writes. Step 4, after I have outlined the drawing, I begin putting in the tone values. I start by roughing in carefully with the charcoal, then rubbing in the required tones with my finger. My hands naturally are quite dry, so I can do this. If your hands are naturally moist, it will be necessary for you to employ a stump in doing this. Now moving on to step 5, and unfortunately he's covering up part of the drawing, so you can't really see some additional work that he did on the drawing, which is unfortunate. But he's continuing to make changes and refinements. And let's see what he writes here. Step 5, thank God for kneaded erasers. All the time I'm putting in the values, I'm correcting and cleaning up with the kneaded eraser. I seem to work about as much with the eraser as with the charcoal. As I have said, I also have a hard eraser handy when the kneaded one can't do the job. Finally, of course, I spray fixative on the completed drawing. So let's look at these different stages again. And between this stage and this one here, I think you can see quite a difference. See how crooked things look here? Not very nice looking. But then in step 3, he's corrected various parts so that what he ends up with is a somewhat exaggerated version of what the character in the photograph looks like. But he didn't exaggerate the drawing so much that the drawing looks like a caricature or a cartoon. There are just slight exaggerations of the features and some other parts of the head, possibly. And this helps to intensify what this character looks like. You begin to feel that this is a real person, a real character with a real personality. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to place that first drawing that he made, which is the tracing of the photograph, right next to this drawing in which he made various changes. And now you can compare the two, and you can see that Mr. Rockwell made quite a few changes to that first drawing, the tracing drawing of the photograph. In that tracing drawing, he, of course, just traced what was in the photograph. And he didn't attempt to make any kind of changes. So that's the first step. You accurately trace the photograph, but then later you go in there like he did and you make changes. You have to make changes. You can't leave it the way it is. If you left it that way, well, you end up with a terrible looking drawing. But you can see the kind of changes Mr. Rockwell made, and one of those changes is the mouth. Take a look at this mouth, and then this one here. And here you can see a definite smile, while here you're not sure what that mouth is doing. Is it a smile? What is it? But here Mr. Rockwell made it a definite smile, so that there's no mistake as to what the emotion in this head is, while here there isn't any emotion. You don't know what this character's feeling, but here you are definitely seeing a happy character. You know what his emotion is. Mr. Rockwell is thinking about emotion, and he's thinking about how can I convey that emotion. He knows how to convey emotion. So you react very positively to a drawing like that in which you feel an emotion. And then, of course, what he also did was he raised the eyebrows. You can see those eyebrows have been raised up somewhat, while in his outline tracing here, those eyebrows haven't been raised up. And then he made numerous other changes that I'm not going to go into. Of course, he parted his hair differently. Here the hair is parted in the middle, here it isn't. So you can't just get away tracing a photograph and leaving it the way it is. And unfortunately, doing a really good drawing is not that easy. You have to know anatomy, which of course he knew. He was a superb draftsman who knew anatomy, and he knew what changes need to be made to a tracing like this in order to wind up with a really good drawing. A drawing of a head that expresses an emotion, a definite emotion. And I'm back. And that's because it's time to wrap up this show and send Mr. Rockwell back to wherever he came from. Thank you for being on the show, Mr. Rockwell. Actually, I'm not sure whether he actually wanted to be on the show. But since he can't speak, I'll never know. Now I have to check in with Giuseppe to see if he's ready to send Mr. Rockwell back. Giuseppe, can you hear me? He says he can hear me and that he has found his eyeball. It was located right underneath the couch. Once he found it, he inserted it back into his head. This time, instead of using crazy glue, he tells me he stapled the eyeball into his head and everything looks perfect now. And therefore, he was able to locate the flux capacitor on the time machine, and the time machine is now ready to send Mr. Rockwell back. Okay, Giuseppe, go ahead and send Mr. Rockwell back. Giuseppe tells me that Mr. Rockwell will be disappearing from the couch at any moment now. And there he goes. Well, thank you, Giuseppe. Wait a minute. Giuseppe is telling me that he has to now leave for his other job, which is the bell ringer at the Notre Dame Cathedral in France. He tells me he loves to do that. He loves to ring those bells, jumping up on the bells and swinging back and forth on them, laughing, and just having a grand old time, he tells me. Oh, that's interesting. From time machine inventor to bell ringer. Well, I hope you enjoy yourself over there, Giuseppe, but I will be needing you again in case I make another one of these shows. And Giuseppe tells me that he will come back if I need him, but only if I need him. Otherwise, he's going to stay with his bells. Well, have a good trip there, Giuseppe, jumping around on those bells. And now, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you for watching, and please tell all your friends about my show, about my videos. And if you want to see more shows like this, then please leave a comment. Let me know. Tell me what that you want to see more shows. Goodbye. Until next time.